Greetings, Necromancers. CoNDOR Season 8 has begun, and with that, I figured we'd go over some of the basics of Necrodancer racing. In this video, we're just going to be covering the most basics of basics and only going through the options menu, both to cover some settings that are required by CoNDOR rules, as well as some optional settings, which might help you to become a more effective speedrunner. Let's get started. First off is the gameplay options menu. This is where most of the required options are going to be, so let's just go down the list here. The first three options, show item hints, always show item names, always show enemy hearts, all must be unchecked as per CoNDOR rules. Afterwards, we have the quick lobby movement, which I would recommend enabling, as it will allow you to move around the lobby much more easily and much more conveniently. The show diamond reminder, which, unless you are playing a lot of single zones mode practice, you can probably uncheck and leave that way. Pause when minimized, while not enforced by CoNDOR rules, is something I would recommend checking. With it unchecked, if the game window ever loses focus, it will continue to run, even as you do not have control over the game, which means that when you tab back in, a bunch of beats will all elapse all at once and potentially kill you. So having that checked will disable that and prevent that from happening. Show cutscenes must be disabled for CoNDOR racing. Lastly, boss intros must be enabled. This is primarily for commentary purposes, as it makes it easier for commentators to identify the boss being fought before arriving into the arena, but also serves a purpose in leaderboard chasing, as the boss intro splash screens temporarily pause the in-game time, which you can take advantage of in some ways. So that's all in the gameplay options. Let's move on to the audio options. Audio options is pretty simple. You've got the sound volume and the music volume. I would recommend having the music volume slightly higher than the sound volume, as it is what you need to make sure you're keeping in beat with, and sound effects can be a little bit delayed compared to the music and cause you to fall behind if they are too loud compared to the music. I do not recommend muting sound altogether, though, as enemy movement sound effects can give you important audio cues, such as knowing when a trampling red dragon that you haven't seen yet is approaching. Enabling the pre-boss sound effect is strongly recommended to have unchecked. This effect is enabled by default and causes the in-game audio to be muffled on boss floors until you open the door into the boss arena. This can make trapdoor fights very difficult to stay on beat with and can cause a lot of problems, especially with death metal trapdoors, so highly recommend unchecking that. You also have the option in DLC to have Douse as the shopkeeper. This is entirely up to preference, but I would generally recommend disabling this and running the standard shopkeeper. The reason being that Douse singing is a lot more variable than the standard voice patch for the normal shopkeeper, and as such can be a little bit of a distraction. Moving on to the graphical options. Full screen is up to personal preference. VSync is generally best left unchecked, but you can enable it if you are having some screen tearing problems. Just experiment, see what seems better for your setup. View multiplier here is something we'll go over later when we get down to resolution. The HUD heart, while not enforced by CoNDOR regulations, I would recommend unchecking, as it is a huge, bulky part of the interface that is visually distracting and covers up the point at which the beat bars collide. Beat bars I would personally recommend checking, as it gives you a visual indicator as to whether you are on or off beat, which is a good extra check in case you're not noticing by audio that you are falling off beat. The visuals can give you an extra clue, but that is up to personal preference. Many racers run with beat bars disabled to completely clean the interface of the sort of distractions. Screen shake is generally recommended to have unchecked. Most racers will disable this, as the screen shake can be a little bit of a source of distraction and make reading enemy movements on the fly a little difficult at times, but some racers do leave it checked to give further visual cues as to, again, approaching mini-bosses and such, as in approaching but not yet visible red dragon will cause some screen shake. The speedrun timer should be enabled, and I believe this is in CoNDOR rules, so make sure it's up. Disco floor is up to personal preference again. If your stream is having trouble processing it, as the disco floor can be a little bit of a bitrate killer for streaming purposes, you can disable it. But having it enabled does give you a little bit more of a subtle visual cue as to parity with enemies that you might otherwise be having trouble reading. So it can be a useful visual cue. It's mostly personal preference and can be disabled if needed. Post-death replay should absolutely be enabled. Post-death replay allows you to review your plays right before the moment of death, making it that much easier to learn from your mistakes and learn what you could have done better to survive. This is an essential part of improving in Necrodancer. As in Necrodancer, you will die a lot, and you need to learn from your mistakes in order to advance further. Particles should be enabled if you can handle it. Some lower-end systems might struggle to render particles without lagging, and if it comes down to it, you can disable them. But be warned that this can cause some variance in seed generation in Zone 2 due to a bug associated with moles. If you have particles disabled in a CoNDOR race, you should let your opponent know so that they have the option of also disabling it to maintain a matching seed. Lastly, resolution and, in conjunction, the view multiplier. CoNDOR enforces a strict set of rules regarding zoom level and resolution. You need to have a combination of either 960 by 540 resolution with a 2x multiplier, 1440 by 810 with a 3x multiplier, or 1920 by 1080 with a 4x multiplier. If you're getting an error saying that you cannot run one of those resolutions, most likely your monitor does not support that aspect ratio and you'll need to run the game windowed instead of full screen. Moving on to controls. Most of this is preference, but I would highly recommend that you set up a completely separate set of alternate keys for the key combination actions. Once you do this, you'll also get the Ignore Multi-Press Combos option to appear when every key combination has an alternate key. My personal preference is to have the basic directions on one hand and all of the spells and item combinations on another hand. Show default HUD text should be unchecked if you do this, as this will have the HUD display the shortcut keys that you can use to use those items instead of the directional combinations. For instance, it will say A instead of down left here. In conjunction, I also recommend enabling the Ignore Multi-Press Combos action, as this completely restricts item usage to one hand and movement to another, preventing you from having any accidents where a moment of panic might cause you to use an item when you intend to just move. Moving on to Latency Calibration, you can use the auto calibration setting or press the S key to skip into a manual setup. Most setups will require a small amount of positive audio offset, but it's going to vary from system to system, so play around with it until it feels right. And lastly, we have Change Soundtrack. This is, again, mostly up to preference, but it is worth mentioning that if you have a lower-end PC, the Danny B soundtrack can have some issues in the Coral Rift fight, as the Danny B version, and only the Danny B version, attempts to play 5 separate audio tracks overlaid with each other. If your system struggles to keep up with this, it can cause some weird fluctuations in timing windows and cause you to unjustly drop beats where you did not miss them. Another issue is with the Family Jewels soundtrack. In the remastered version included in Amplified, many tracks are significantly off-sync. While this generally won't affect cadence play, it is absolutely recommended that you avoid Family Jewels if playing Aria, or especially Bolt or Coda. And one more thing, outside of the options menu, if you are playing in Season 8, you will also need to download and run the CoNDOR Season 8 mod. This mod removes axes, the boots of leaping, and the boots of lunging from the game, as these items were deemed too powerful in a common speedrunning setting. You can find a link to the CoNDOR Season 8 mod in the description below. That should be all for this video right now. Keep an eye out for future installments in this series as I go into detail about effective racing strategies. See you next time.